Hi, everyone. We're just going to get started here. Thank you all for coming. And also, I want to say hi to those who are tuning in our live stream. We do live stream our events. First and foremost, my name is Andy Rathman Noonan. I am the Executive Director of the National Science and Technology Medals Foundation. We're thrilled to be here tonight for what I know will be an inspiring look at the life and work of one of the greatest scientists of our time, Dr. Shirley Ann Jackson. I'd like to first thank those who made tonight possible. Thank you to the leadership and staff of Howard University for having us here tonight in this beautiful building on this incredible campus. I want to thank our agency sponsors, the National Science Foundation, as well as the United States Patent and Trademark Office. It's really their generous support that allows us to take these evenings across the country and share them with audiences all over the world. And finally, I want to thank Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Rensselaer has been a valued partner with us for many years. And they share in our belief that we accomplish more when we highlight a multitude of perspectives in the STEM community. Our foundation was founded 30 years ago on the belief that scientific and technological advancements are powerful agents for positive change. Our mission then was to celebrate the laureates of the National Medal of Technology Innovation and the National Medal of Science. These are the nation's highest honors in science and technology. But in the last 5 years, as we uphold those duties, our foundation has evolved dramatically, expanding to address a social imperative, a need for inclusion in the STEM community. We believe that by amplifying the voices often left unheard, we are taking the first step toward building an inclusive coalition of STEM students and young innovators. Through our An Evening With program, which you'll all experience here tonight, we seek to inspire future generations of scientists, technologists, researchers, and innovators by connecting them with the women and men who have reached the pinnacle of success in STEM. We are grateful for the opportunity to partner with premier institutions like Howard, because without their support, we simply could not do what we do. Our featured guest this evening was described by Time magazine as perhaps the ultimate role model for women in science. Dr. Shirley Ann Jackson is a trailblazer, a leader, and a woman with a career full of firsts. Dr. Jackson is the first African-American woman to be honored with the National Medal of Science for her work in condensed matter physics and particle physics. She received her doctorate in theoretical elementary particle physics from MIT, making her the first African-American woman to receive a PhD from MIT in any field, and the second African-American woman to receive a bachelor's from MIT. One of two in the same graduating class. Dr. Jackson is also a DC native and has led a long and historic career as a scientist, educator, and leader in academia, industry, and government. She currently serves as the 18th president of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, America's oldest technological research university. Her relentless pursuit of excellence in every phase of her life makes her a beacon for those who follow in her footsteps. Tonight, we hope to give all of you an understanding of her journey to success, the notable accomplishments, of course, but also the challenges she had to overcome along the way. Leading our discussion tonight will be Howard University's Vice President of Research, Dr. Bruce Jones. Dr. Jones oversees the university's research infrastructure while spearheading a robust research portfolio. Through its Office of Research, Howard University is committed to setting an agenda for cutting-edge research. Under Dr. Jones's leadership, students and faculty from all disciplines collaborate on research projects that extend far beyond this campus. As a fellow leader in higher education research, Dr. Jones is a perfect guide for tonight's conversation, and we're incredibly grateful he's here with us tonight. So, if you all please join me as we welcome Dr. Shirley Ann Jackson and Dr. Bruce Jones to the stage.
Dr. Jackson, I just want to say initially, thank you all for coming tonight. We truly appreciate you. And thank you to Andy, the National Science and Technology Medals Foundation, for allowing this to occur. So we are really so grateful that you are truly here. You know, we all talk about defying the odds, Dr. Jackson, and what that means. You know, when we think about defying the odds, we usually think about achieving the impossible. We usually think about greatness and excellence. not just in theory, but in practice. We usually think about individuals who are capable of engaging in transformative change, and I mean positive transformative change. And with your career and the experience and wisdom you have shared with us already, you are the personification of what's meant by defying the odds. And we are so grateful that you are here on this campus and appreciative that you could share that experience and wisdom with us here tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right to the questions. First, as Andy pointed out, you are a native of Washington, D.C., and a graduate of Roosevelt High School, and spoke to some Roosevelt High School students this afternoon over lunch. It was a wonderful exchange. Could you talk about the roots, your beginnings at that level in high school, leading right on up into the sciences, and the role of schooling at that point in your career choices?
Well, first of all, let me say good evening to everyone here. It's good to see some of my old friends here. This is very special. Thank you. Thank you for being here. So I grew up here in Washington, D.C., originally living in the Georgetown area. My grandmother had a home at 22nd and N Street. It doesn't exist anymore. And so I spent most of my time growing up here in Northwest Washington, essentially between Petworth and Tacoma Park. And when I started school, schools were segregated by law. But then two things came together that essentially, I think, set me on the path that I've been on. The first was the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision that desegregated the public schools, and Washington, D.C. moved with relative alacrity to do that in the sense of integrating the schools the next year in 1955. The second was the Soviet launch of the Sputnik 1 satellite, and at that point it really made all of our policymakers and government leaders worry about falling behind the Soviets vis-a-vis the space race, which really was a science-based defense race. And so that shifted the focus in public education very strongly to science and math. And so a number of programs and new approaches to teaching science and math came into being. Now, with the integration of the schools, the public schools made a very careful choice about picking who the teachers would be. And so many of the teachers that I had, who were African American women, not exclusively, but many of them, are women who, if they had been of my era or later, probably would have been college professors. And some of them did work in the government as mathematicians. And in fact, my math teacher did this. And so I had this unique experience of having some of the best teachers around who also were inspirational. I was tested in the 6th grade and placed in a so-called honors track, which was an accelerated academic program, and I essentially finished high school a year early, but we all stayed around and took more advanced subjects. And so I had math through calculus and physics and so on, but I also studied Latin for 6 years and studied economics. And my economics teacher's husband was dean of students here at Howard University, Armour Blackburn. And so my economics teacher was Helen Blackburn. The point of my telling you this is that these women were very inspirational to me, and they pushed us very strongly. And because of being in the honors program, we had very small classes. So they were in our math classes, and I have a couple of my fellow high school students, classmates here. We had classes as small as 10 or 12 students, and so it was very unusual. So I ended up being my high school valedictorian, and off I went to MIT, which was suggested by we had at that point a high school assistant principal for girls and a high school assistant principal for boys. And so it was the assistant principal for boys who suggested I go to MIT. And my father, who did not go to college, in fact, he did not graduate from high school, also wanted me to go to MIT. Now, my parents, I was lucky. because people said, did you have role models? My real role models were my parents. My mother did go to college, and my mother was born in 1915. But her younger siblings, she was the youngest, her older siblings, I should say, pooled their resources to send her to a boarding school, believe it or not, because there was no real high school for Negroes at that point in the part of Virginia where she grew up. And her parents died when she was young and when she was a teenager. And so she went from there to college and even did graduate work at Hampton University. My father, on the other hand, did not graduate from high school, but he was gifted mechanically and mathematically. And he was actually at Normandy, part of the Normandy invasion in World War II. And the amphibious landing vehicles kept losing their rudders. They kept breaking. And people were trying to figure out how to fix them. And my father came up with a special mechanical splice that solved the problem with cables. And because of that, he got a Bronze Star. And his method was taught throughout France for the rest of the war. And in fact, was taught to people before they went. So my mother taught all of us to read before we went to kindergarten. And my father nurtured my interest in math and science. He would help my sisters and me. My brother was the youngest, so he was always the baby. But my sisters and I were interested more than I was interested, but we were all part of we had our own little club. My father would help us design and build go-karts and taught us about the kind of aerodynamic design as a way of winning, because these were strictly gravity-fed carts. And so it was less about my skill as a driver and more about the designs that our father helped us to make. So that's how I grew up. So and even though I was in the segregated schools up until mid-elementary school, it was a kind of a unique way to grow up. And so then I went to the Parkview School here. I started at Charles Young in Northeast and then went to the Parkview School, which both of them were segregated. And then we switched to Barnard, and that's where I finished my elementary school, went to McFarland and then to Roosevelt. And it was at McFarland that the testing occurred. Well, it was actually at Barnard before we went to McFarland. And so then I went off to MIT. And that was an interesting experience. I can keep talking, but I'll stop.
Well, it sounds like you really had a very nurturing upbringing, high value on education.
Totally.
But when you talk about Sputnik, it also happened in the context of science and engineering, STEM, being primarily for men.
Correct.
So once you left secondary education, now you're out in the world. How did you navigate an environment that was dominated by men and largely white males, and as a female, as an African American? I mean, how did you do that, I guess I'm asking?
Well,
you're curious too.
Thank you. Well, again, I have this philosophy, and it's been true in my life, that you live through your window in time. And when a window in time opens for you, especially an open opportunity, then if you step through it, then many things can happen. So I went to MIT in the 1960s, and there were about 5 to 7 African Americans in my freshman class out of a freshman class of 900. And there were 2 African American women, another woman by the name of Jenny Rudd and I. And people would always confuse us. They'd call her Shirley and call me Jenny. And so it was a funny time. It turns out that Jenny and I were the first 2 African American women to get a bachelor's degree from MIT. Most people know about the PhD. There had been at least one African American woman before us, but she didn't finish. And so it was not exactly, I went expecting it to be, fun, because I was going to school with other techies like me. We called ourselves nerds then. And there were, except that they were mainly men, as you suggest. But at the time I went, MIT had just opened a residence hall, a dorm for women, which was fortuitous because that's where I lived. Interestingly enough, I had looked at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, but at that point, the women could not live on the campus. They lived on the campus of another college called Russell Sage. So I went to MIT, and it was rather isolating, because it was isolating both with respect to the men and the women in terms of how I was treated. So no one would sit next to me in lecture halls many times. They would not eat with me in the cafeteria. And if I sat at a table, they would be done. The women would be done. If I was there early, nobody would sit at the table. And my first physics problem set I was working away on, and my room was across the hall. I had a single from the rest facility. So I had to get up and go. And when I went, I saw all the women on my floor, the freshman women, and they were working on the physics problem set. And so I went, and when I went back to my room, I gathered my paper and I said, well, may I join you? And one of them looked up and said, go away. And I said, but I think I know, I've done half the problems and I know how to do the others. And then another one looked up and said, well, didn't you hear her? She said, go away. So I went back to my room and I cried and I cried. But then after about half an hour, 45 minutes, I said, I have to finish these problems. And so I went back and finished the problem sets. And so this kind of characterized what went on. So I had to really learn to work alone. I would not argue that that's the best way, but it's the way I had to work at that point. But I did well at MIT, and one of my professors suggested that I might want to do nuclear physics. And I said, no, I'm interested in condensed matter physics, because I had done a joint bachelor's thesis in physics and materials science and engineering. And interestingly enough, I did it in the lab of a junior faculty member who worked with a senior faculty member whose course I had taken as a freshman. And when I took his course, I had the highest grade in the class, and I went to talk to him about working in his lab, and he told me, well, he wasn't sure. Colored girls should learn a trade. Because I was talking to him about being a physics major, potentially, or something like that. And so colored girls should learn a trade. So again, I was rather demoralized, but then I said, well, I guess my trade needs to be physics.
Again.
So that's what I did. Now, I don't want to make you all think that it was all so easy, because it wasn't. There were tears. But I had grown up in the church, so I would read passages from the Bible, and I thought about my father and how much it meant to him and others. And I'm not the type to give up. And I've always felt there's no place that anybody else should be that I can't be. And so, but I also joined a sorority, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and that helped me develop a larger community. Now, in those days, it was a New England regional chapter, because there were not enough women on any given campus to have a chapter. And so these women came from Boston University, Boston College, UMass Boston, UMass Amherst, which was 100 miles away, from Wellesley, from Pembroke, which was Brown University, from Radcliffe, which was Harvard, and from Yale. So we pledged for 6 months. And so that really gave me a community. And then I actually became president of the chapter. But also through that, started doing volunteer work at Boston City Hospital, and I tutored math at the Roxbury Y. And so that took me out of, what I thought my problems were, to really help somebody else. And so all of those things helped me. And so then the final thing I would say is that, so the year I was graduating, I had decided I did want to do condensed matter physics, not nuclear. So I applied to Harvard because it was Harvard, MIT because it was MIT. But then I applied to Brown because Leon Cooper of the Bardeen-Cooper-Schrieffer theory of superconductivity was there. I applied to Penn because Robert Schrieffer was there, and to the University of Chicago because Leo Falikoff, who had done some of the foundational work in so-called many-body theory that the BCS theory was based on, was at Chicago. And I had been admitted to all of them. They had given me fellowships and all of that. And I was invited to Penn to come potentially work in the summer before I started. And I did, and it was a great visit. On the way back to the airport at the end of the visit, I was getting a ride from a friend and a soror. On the radio came the broadcast that Dr. King had been shot and then he had died. So I made a decision that I would stay at MIT, that I felt I could make a difference. And it was an excellent place, for grad school. But it wasn't so active in condensed matter at that point, so I did my PhD in elementary particle physics, particle theory. I was always interested in theoretical physics, and I felt that what I learned there and the techniques, the mathematical techniques, could be used in condensed matter physics. And so I got my PhD at MIT, and then I did a postdoc at Fermilab, the Fermi National Accelerator Lab in Batavia. And I spent a year in Europe at the European Organization for Nuclear Research, and that was the year the J-psi particle was discovered. And I knew Sam Ting from MIT. He shared the Nobel Prize for that discovery with Bert Richter, who was at Stanford. And I worked on neutrinos. But then I went back and finished my postdoc at Fermilab. And in those days, it was a little hard to get jobs in physics. But I had spent a summer at the University of Colorado in Boulder and had met a theoretical physicist who was at Bell Labs. His name was John Clauder. And we had interacted. And so I got the nerve to call him up. And so he said, well, I'll introduce you to the head of the theory department at Bell Labs. So I went to an American Physical Society meeting in Atlanta, met with the head of the theory department. He was going to invite me to give a seminar. Now, you know the difference between seminars and colloquia, right?
Oh, yes.
And then after we talked, he decided I should be invited for a colloquium. So I did that, and I talked a good game about using the topological properties of solutions to nonlinear field theories in condensed matter physics. So they gave me a job. But it was a limited term member of the technical staff, so it was like a glorified postdoc, second postdoc. But I took it, and I got to work with Morris Rice, who was the head of the theory department, and Patrick Lee, who also was in the theory department. And we worked on charge density waves in layered transition metal dichalcogenides. And sure enough, I discovered these topological objects under the certain conditions when these charge density waves formed. And that these objects basically determine the conductivity and thermodynamics of the system. So it wasn't a bad piece of work. So
Wow.
I had earlier talked with IBM, and they heard about this, and they offered me a job. So when Bell Labs heard about it, they decided they would accelerate giving me a permanent position. And so I'll stop there. I spent 15 years at Bell Labs doing theoretical physics.
My goodness, there are so many awards, accolades that you have. I mean, you were chair of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. You were founder of the International Nuclear Regulators Association. You were appointed in 2014 by President Obama to the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the World Economic Forum, International Fellow of the British Royal Academy of Engineering and the American Philosophical Society. I wonder, with all of these, this is sort of like 4 or 5 lifetimes. And by the way, I had in my notes 53 honorary doctorates, but as of today, I'm told by Richie Hunter, it's 54 honorary doctorates. Now, of all of those, and also the National Medal of Science, by the way, which is the nation's highest honor in science and engineering. Out of all of those, are there any favorites, or I mean, they all have to be favorites. I mean, what is your sense of-
this is how I feel. Let me back up. There are 2 ways to think about accolades, or achievements, and I separate achievements from accolades, by the way. So every place I've gone, I've tried to make a difference, and so I told you about some of my work in condensed matter physics and some of the work I did in particle physics. And then as chairman of the NRC, I was able to do a lot. And by the way, my personal assistant from when I was chairman of the NRC is here, Evelyn Williams. And I wouldn't have been able to do the job without her. And so at the NRC, I drove the development of the agency's first strategic plan, developed a planning, budgeting, and performance management system to make it operate in a more business-like fashion, drove the institution of so-called risk-informed, performance-based regulation, where we used probabilistic risk assessment on a more regularized basis in regulatory decision-making. I did spearhead the formation of the International Nuclear Regulators Association. And we promulgated a Convention on Nuclear Safety, which we finally got the US Senate to ratify. We were the last country to do it, even though we promulgated it. But I also had the chance to work with Vice President Gore as part of the US, believe it or not, Russian Federation Binational Commission on Scientific and Economic Cooperation. Those were the days, right? But because of that, I got involved with a number of the newly independent states of the former Soviet Union in helping them to develop a nuclear regulatory framework, write nuclear regulations, and inviting their regulators, newly minted regulators, because they were left with operating plants left over from the Soviet era, to the NRC for training. Now, I have to back up for a moment. What was interesting about this, and it ties into the work directly at the NRC, is that when the newly independent states were formed, a number of them had these Soviet-designed reactors, including ones of the Chernobyl design, the RBMK reactors, and that's the one that blew up in Chernobyl. But when they inherited these reactors, these countries were not left with the designs of the plants, or what we call the design basis. So we actually, the NRC, spent time helping them to reconstruct the design basis of the plants, so they could then do probabilistic risk assessment to look at and get a better sense of the vulnerabilities and hopefully to remediate the vulnerabilities of the plants. So I'm proud of all of that. In addition, I became chairman not long after Nelson Mandela had been freed and was elected as president in South Africa. And there was a U.S.-South Africa Binational Commission, the so-called Gore and Mbeki Commission. And in each of these commissions, I chaired the Nuclear Safety Committee. And so we literally, the NRC, under my leadership, worked with the ANC government then, Nelson Mandela's government, to literally help them develop a policy framework and regulations and regulatory framework for the nuclear facilities. Because those plants had been run by the Afrikaner government up to that point. And so there were these newly minted folks that, again, had to oversee these plants. Now, so again, I felt that was very important. So if I look at risk-informed performance-based regulation, forming the INRA, creating a license renewal process to extend the licenses of nuclear power plants, working with the newly independent states of the former Soviet Union with their regulatory framework, working with the South African government, Nelson Mandela. I would say those were accomplishments, achievements I was very proud of. Now I've gotten accolades, such as being elected to this society or that one, but the highest of the accolades that's most meaningful to me is being a recipient of the National Medal of Science, of course, but also to receive it from President Barack Obama. And because President Obama really appreciated the importance of bringing science into public policy, into decision making, and into addressing major challenges and opportunities for our country and for the world. So that was very meaningful.
Thank you. Last fall, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine came out with a report that was entitled Minority Serving Institutions Are Vastly Underutilized in the STEM Areas. And they talked about in that report this notion of intentionality, and intentionality with respect to bringing more women and minorities into the STEM fields. In other words, it has to be done with design. It's not something that will happen on its own. I just want to know your view on that. How do you view this notion of intentionality? Is it an effective strategy? Is there policy that can emerge from that? Because then you also have those that say, well, you're singling out and advantaging women and minorities. What about other groups? I mean, I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Well, there are a couple of comments that can be made. Number one, those who work with me know I believe in intentionality.
Oh, okay.
They hear it from me all the time in anything that one sets out to do. And to me, that means having a clear focus, having a clear strategy, being steadfast, and measuring results. And so, of course, I believe in intentionality in that arena. Secondly, women and underrepresented minorities have been disadvantaged in these fields. And so I've always articulated that we were facing a quiet crisis, namely that talent comes in, all ethnicities, genders, religions, national origins, etc. And that if one doesn't tap the complete talent pool, then one is not going to be able to solve great problems. We've benefited in this country from having brilliant scientists and engineers come to us from all over the world. Now that is at risk right now. But we also have under-tapped the talent pool of women and minorities in this country. And so when you bring those two together, if we stay on this path, then we are going to run into a calamity. And if you add women and minorities together, that's really the majority.
Yes.
And so that's the underrepresented majority. And so I am one who says you tap the complete talent pool. And so that doesn't mean because I focus here that I don't focus there. It means that as an educator and as a scientist who believes in the power of science and technology to uplift people's lives, then we have to tap and utilize all the talent. And it is an underutilized resource, but it has also been, for those who have not yet made it to the minority-serving institutions, but are minorities, it is an undereducated resource. And so we have to give a lot more focus there.
Now, having said that, have you seen progress over the years since you were a student at MIT? And I mean, is there kernels of hope? And I know that can be difficult in current political times, but are there kernels of hope with respect to what you just indicated, and also the kinds of transformative actions you engage in as president at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute?
Well, I'm one who adheres to President Obama's perspective, even in hard times, that ultimately the arc of history will bend toward justice. Mm-hmm. And I think we've seen enough, and I've seen enough in my life, to believe that there has been obviously great progress, but that more progress is possible. That doesn't mean there won't be setbacks, and we are facing a challenging time, because there has been great progress relative to women and minorities in STEM fields, but in the last several years, there's been a drop-off, particularly in fields like computer science, some of the physical sciences, and so on. And in 2017, according to the Atlantic Monthly, there were some subfields of STEM where there were 0 African Americans who got PhDs. So we have a lot of work to do. And I think what one has to do is to be tenacious and relentless and resilient. But we are resilient. But we just have to be tenacious and relentless. And I am relentless. And so at the university, we are being intentional about seeking that talent out. We are not where we should be or wish to be, but we have made a lot of progress with bringing women and now underrepresented minorities into the university. But it's not just bringing them in, it's graduating them and launching them into great careers. And that's what our focus is.
Well, I'm going to be a little bit selfish here in asking you this next question, being that I am at Howard University, and probably the most famous HBCU in existence.
Although some of the Morehouse men might challenge you. And my husband is a graduate of Fisk University, but I'll say that tonight.
What would you advise HBCUs in general, particularly as many more move toward a research emphasis than the traditional liberal teaching arts institutions, and moving into the whole research realm across all fields, of course, including STEM, and the causes and the challenges, given that HBCUs historically have been underfunded? Yes. And have faced a whole host of issues that other institutions of higher education have not had to face. Is there any just sort of general advice that you would provide in that given that context and that history?
Well, I don't pretend to be an expert on minority-serving institutions or HBCUs, so I try to be careful about that. But I do think that Howard University should be a Tier 1 research institution. I believe it will be, can be, and will be a Tier 1. But I think it takes a doubling down on that focus. It takes partnering with other institutions, with creating shared infrastructure and demanding excellence and seeking support, the right kinds of support in every place that you can. Even at Rensselaer, we're not the biggest of the research universities. We're well respected. So partnerships and core and shared infrastructure have been important. Strategic focus is important. We don't try to do everything, but what we do, we try to work in areas that we know to be important and in areas that undergird many other areas, such as data, AI, computation, biotechnology and the life sciences, nanotechnology and advanced materials, computational science and engineering writ large, energy, the environment, and smart systems. And believe it or not, media, the arts, science, and technology. Because those things allow you to do research in unique ways and to teach students in unique ways. And so we stay relentlessly focused in those areas, and the institute-wide priorities that we focus on derive from those. And we've built the infrastructure to support what we do. And then we go out and try to educate students at the leading edge, hire faculty at the leading edge, but to partner both internally in the university to get people to work across disciplines, but also to partner with other institutions. Because we're not the wealthiest, but we feel that we can be impactful both nationally and globally in that way. Many of the great inventions and steps that have carried this country forward have actually come from African Americans. They're undersung. And we need to tell more of those stories. And I remember reading the book Black Apollo of Science. It's about the cell biologist Ernest Everett Just.
Yes.
And if you read his story and the work he actually did and the accomplishments he made, even though he was not really allowed to work at any of the great research labs, even though he had graduated from Dartmouth and was top of his class or near that. But he stepped through his window in time. And we need to tell more of that, because I also believe that more young minority students need to know, and more African Americans, about seminal work that African Americans have done in the fundamental sciences. Mm-hmm. Now, one of them is a gentleman sitting on the first row here, Dr. James Turner, who was at MIT with me and is a well-renowned plasma physicist. And so, Jim, it's good to see you.
This has been phenomenal, and it has been a pleasure hearing your wisdom, expertise, sharing that. You all ought to know that Dr. Jackson was with our students this afternoon, and of course they were mesmerized by her. And
I was mesmerized by them.
But you truly are a role model, as Time magazine said, for women in science, but I say for all of us.
Thank you.
And a national treasure. I want to make sure now it was.
If you live long enough, you become a national treasure.
Well, I suspect that was conferred probably very early in your career, given your accomplishments. The National Science Board decreed Dr. Jackson as a national treasure. So we're honored to have you here again in this historic room, and very inspired by you. And I hope when you talk about partnerships that Howard University, that we can continue our partnerships.
Absolutely, especially since you stole Kib Lewis from us.
And you can't have her. But thank you so much, Dr. Jackson, please.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
And now, why don't we open the floor to some questions? Right in the back.
Hi, thank you. Hello, how you doing? My name is Keith Marshall, and I happen to be a physics and mathematics teacher at Oxon Hill High School in Prince George's County, Maryland.
Great.
And my question to you is, I wanted to ask you, what advice or would you have for someone seeking a mentor, such as a graduate student and a professor? What advice do you have for that?
Well, I think I have a philosophy about what I call witting and unwitting mentors. And a witting mentor is one whom you know you might approach and deliberately helps you. But then there are unwitting mentors whom you respect what they do. You might not even know them really. And if you knew them, you may or may not like them. But you learn something about how they've gotten to where they've gotten. And you try to inculcate that into how you lay out your own path. But then more specifically to your question, I think one has to be, if one sees someone that one wishes to have as a mentor, to not be afraid to go and talk with that person. Now that person may not agree to be a full-fledged, all-the-time mentor, but it could be someone you can just talk to and get advice from periodically. Interestingly enough, when I was at Bell Labs, Arno Penzias, who became vice president for research, and Robert Wilson shared a Nobel Prize for the discovery of the cosmic microwave background radiation that confirmed the Big Bang theory. And for some reason, Arno Penzias wanted to talk to me about once a month. So he would just call me in. So the first time he did, I thought I was being fired or something. But he would just throw out bits of advice. And it wasn't exactly a total two-way conversation, but he would kind of throw out bits of advice. And so I listened, and I tried to take it in. And so one piece of advice he gave me once was this. He says, you know, whenever you go to give a talk somewhere, you're going to have a halo. And then he quickly said, but it's not because you're an angel. He says it's just that people will know who you are. You know, you'll be an oddity. And you can either take it and feel self-conscious about it, or you can use it as a platform knowing that people will remember what you said or did to do the best you can. So years later, when I became chairman of the NRC, one of my first forays was to travel to Asia, to Japan, to what was called the Japan Atomic Energy Forum. And this invited all of these folks in the nuclear arena from around Japan and Asia, both in the industry and in government. So there were about 2,000 people there. And so it's 2,000 people, and here I am. But they wanted me to be one of the main speakers because I was chairman of the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So I was extremely nervous because I was speaking in English. I didn't know if I had the cadence right for people to translate. But then what Arno Penzias told me came into my mind. And so I just got up and gave the speech. So I don't know if he was a witting or an unwitting mentor, but he was. And so having a mentor means taking advantage of whomever you can learn from. And that's really the message.
Yes, right
Thank
here.
you.
In front, right here. Yeah.
So Kurt Holmes, I'm a proud MIT alum, and I remember from my freshman year, I always heard about Shirley Jackson. So you didn't mention that she also founded the MIT Black Student Union.
Oh, no, I didn't know.
And we just recently had an alumni event where you came and spoke. And I'm wondering your thoughts in particular, how people who look at the situation we have today, you talked about diversity and inclusion and what you're doing from an institutional standpoint, but there's a lot of people who aren't in education itself who decry the problem, how can everybody in this room who also cares about that problem contribute to that when they're not necessarily in a position of power? What can people do who are alums of institutions or just workers in an organization or leaders in an organization? Are there any things that we all as individuals can do to help be part of the solution to this national problem?
Well, you know, we all are part of a community somewhere, whether it's work, church, neighborhood, etc. And I think, you know, one has to be unafraid to broach difficult subjects, not to be adversarial, but to try to talk it through. And to whatever extent one has the ability to lead or influence a group, to do that. Secondly, to not be afraid to stand in the wind. And it's easy to say and hard to do. But I've gone through plenty of times when I've been attacked. I could tell you lots of stories about things that happened when I was chairman of the NRC. I could tell you lots of stories about things that have happened since I've been president of the university. But you have to stand in the wind, but keep a cool head.
Yes, either one of you guys. You can.
My name is James Fabumi. I was a few years behind you at MIT, so I didn't quite meet you there. And something that had not been mentioned in this conversation was your work on rising above the gathering storm. And the reason I bring that up is because a couple of weeks ago, I was up in Massachusetts, and I heard a speech from the Chief of Naval Research talking about the current rivalry between the US and China. And we do know that China has more A students than America has students, period. So the whole issue of diversity and potential resistance to diversity intersects with the work that you did in that report. So I wanted you to just make a couple of comments on that in terms of your impression as to what happened after you did all that effort.
Right, this was a report that was done with some other presidents under the aegis of the National Academies. And the idea was that we faced a potential crisis in this country relative to support for basic research. And again, how we could carry out our scientific enterprise in the face of the fact that other nations were investing even more strongly than we. And so I would say that where we are today illustrates that we may be at that point. And so the U.S. has a decision to make about, you know, how it wants to address that. But it's not just China. I mean, China is the big behemoth in this regard, but other nations are also investing in their science and technology enterprises in various ways. But that brings us back to the quiet crisis. I mean, if we don't feel we can still attract and want to attract talent from abroad, and if we feel we can ignore half to 2/3 of our own population, then in terms of the potential for doing great science, then we will be in trouble. And I've never changed in that point of view. But I think there are, you know, people are afraid in many ways to have certain conversations. And instead the conversation focuses on what our differences are and people's dislike or hatred of each other, as opposed to what it means to be an American and to pull together. And I think we have to get back to that.
Professor Shirley Ann Jackson, Manipo, good to see you again, madam. We'll call you Big Sister because you are. You know that we met several times. I will be proud to say that when I was the president of the DC Council of Engineering Activities, societies here in Washington, D.C., I was asked to pick somebody to give the Lifetime Achievement Award. And somebody came to me, a little whispered in my ears that there's a lady at NRC, she's an MIT graduate. I think she's the first to get a PhD in physics, and she's there, and she's African American. I said, oh my God, let's do it. I called her office. I don't know who I spoke to, and I keep calling.
Probably Evelyn.
Sit right next to it.
Yes, and finally she accepted, and we gave her the award, and I still make a big noise about it up to today because you've done such a great work in science. You talked about your background growing up, those who, your father didn't have the big certificate that says I'm a graduate of, but he has the capability and the capacity. There are a lot of things that have been achieved by African Americans in this country. I came from Nigeria and got some degrees at MIT, like my fellow friend here. Professor Louis Gates, Jr. of Harvard University is showing some things about what African Americans have achieved that I'm learning. I stay up late night just to watch. Now, in the area of science and mathematics, blacks have contributed a whole lot, both here and also in Africa. I mean, you know the numbering system, algebra and trigonometry, quadratic equations, and all those things that are still existing today. Is there a medium that you think you can gather some professors, some likes of your level to say, let's create an opportunity to disseminate information, to show people all this great achievement, so kids from K through 12 can get excited and say, if these guys can do it back then when they not even allowed to cross the streets, if I can cross the street and buy anything I want, why can't I be a mathematician, a physicist, an engineer? Some kind of a forum to get those words out to people. Thank you very much for your work, man.
Thank you. No, I agree, and maybe that's something that you and I need to take up on, because I think those who are in leadership positions do have an opportunity to push this, what he's talking about, into curricula, and even to have publications that cover in a more broad-based way. Because if you hear the stories that are told, you'd think that maybe there are exactly 3 blacks that ever
I tell you, and maybe not even that many. But it is something that has come up because my office is beginning a process with Pamela Clark in the back, whereby we will interview a number of people around the famous researchers that have been at Howard University. The material is here, but you really can't go to one place to. And part of my going around talking about research is to be able to say, this is the research prowess that Howard University has, but it's kind of scattered. So we're working to get all, I may come and interview you, see what happens when you stand up and get on your calendar. But we have a lineup of folks that we're going to interview to get that history, at least for Howard. But we need to be doing this in multiple places because, frankly, between you and me, no one else is going to do this. No one else, and if they do it, it's not necessarily going to be what we want to hear. So we definitely have to take the lead on gathering that history, disseminating that history, and especially to our kids, and getting it in the curriculum. Because you can gather it, and it doesn't mean it's going to be taught in the schools. That's right. We know that already. And it doesn't even mean it's going to be taught in black public schools, because the curriculum they use is going to be the curriculum that's used everywhere else. So we have a challenge there, definitely. Yes, right here.
Dr. Jackson, thank you also for the remarks there you shared. As an alumnus of MIT, appreciate you sharing some of the experiences there. Along the line of what you're talking about in terms of getting that history, I know that some schools, and Dr. Jackson is aware of 2 at MIT, we have a history of blacks at MIT, that has been developed, and my colleague and I and some of our alum here are aware of that. It might be an idea to think about how we can collect those across the institutions, as you say, and connect those. And with technology today, that's something that would be easy to do. So it's a thought. My question is in terms of, as Dr. Jackson was speaking earlier about your formative time, in the home you had parents that were your role models in their own ways. In today's time, we hear a lot that that's not the same home that we see, in particular in our country now. We don't have the same foundations. Our communities are not the same. They're racked with a lot of challenges that are going on. And from a perspective of seeing what that meant in your own development, in the context of 2019 going forward, what are some of the opportunities that you can see that our communities can do, some of our institutions? You did mention the church. It was one of the things that also gave you nurture. Some of the institutions can contribute towards strengthening the capacity of our younger people to be in positions to consider opportunities in STEM and other related science and technological areas, as well as the achievement and the excellence that we talk about. What are some of the suggestions you might have at this point in life?
Thank you. Well, I think, having parents who back you creates a constancy and a consistency of support and even discipline. A question then arises as to what one can do if that doesn't exist. And so we do have major institutions in the African American community that have a long history. The fraternities, the sororities, and obviously the churches, the minority serving institutions, and some majority serving. And the question becomes, can we put together a linked superstructure that can provide a constancy of programming and support that can go on year in, year out, week in, week out. But where you don't have the different parts of these organizations, doing this over here and that over there, and deciding on, you could almost think of it as like a common experiential piece and a common even curriculum. I really think we have to do that. And there's a lot of discussion now about SAT scores and who's qualified and who's not. I've always felt that if we allow the argument to come to what I call the college classroom door at the point of entrance, we're never going to solve it. And so one has to reach back and create these structures. And if you want the SATs not to matter anymore, have African Americans ace the test.
That'll be the end of it. Yes, right there. Yes, go ahead, right here. Okay, yeah. That will do it, definitely.
She's rolling her eyes. My name is Paula Duckett, and I have been in classes with Shirley since the 7th grade, from the 7th to the 12th grade. And as I look around, I see a lot of young people in the audience. And I would like for you to share one little episode from our physics class in high school so that the youngsters in the audience will not have to suffer from what I call dyspedagogia, which is failure to learn because of failure to teach. Obviously, I taught for 30 years in DC schools. But if you could share so that they could realize that, excuse me, if there is something they are really not satisfied with in a classroom, that they do have options. And if you could share how you felt and what that issue was back in the day.
You mean the physics teacher we had? Well, we had a physics teacher when I was in high school who would come to class and he just wouldn't teach. And so all of us were sitting in this class, and we were pretty eager beavers and pretty smart kids. But he was teaching us nothing. And I remember we were trying to understand wave motion. And he was supposed to show us the wave motion in a ripple tank, except he didn't do it. And so I raised the question of, well, how are we going to learn about wave motion without the ripple tank? And I don't even remember all the words, but the gist of it was, well, if you want a ripple tank, you do it yourself. So I went home and my father and I made a ripple tank. And then after that, the teacher gave up. He says, Shirley can teach your class. No, I'm not telling you this to get you to applaud me, but I did teach the class. No, for the rest of the semester. But it was easy because I had classmates like Paula and Diane and Ira. And
my second question is, are you going to run in 2020?
well, thank you, Paula, for that compliment. But
Let's take one more question. Yes. Ryan, you're getting your exercise tonight.
Thank you very much. Shirley, thank you so much for sharing your time and wisdom with us. You always, we always are better after hearing you and seeing you. I have a question about a different thing. I saw recently that student debt is now more than $1 trillion. And one of the things that I'm hearing more and more is students who've now gotten a bachelor's degree saying, I wish I hadn't done it because now I've got all this debt I've got to deal with. And it seems like that's a minefield we've got to get through. And on a personal level, my younger daughter is a very successful prosecutor. And in frustration a couple of times, she said, why did I bother going to law school and getting all this debt? I can't buy a house, I can't buy a car, I can't do this, I can't do that. And so, I've run out of things to say. Do you have any thoughts on, what do you say when you encounter a question like that?
well, I mean, I think that's a serious issue, but it's a multi-dimensional issue in a couple of ways. So I'll just tell you straight out that if you look on our website at what our tuition is, the tuition for Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute is over $50,000. And that doesn't include the room and board and other fees and books. And so the real ticket is somewhere north of $60,000. So you could say, how could anybody afford that? But the real issue is that the price is not the cost, because there is an offset having to do with financial aid. And so one thing as a university president that I do urge those who have some measure of success, and that can be across the spectrum, to support your alma mater. Because even though, and there is a question about debt, and I'm going to come back to that more specifically, it does cost money to run universities, in the sense that 80% of our costs are linked to people, faculty, staff to support students. Students are coming to us with more complexities, with psychological problems, with health problems, with learning disabilities, with other things. And we have an obligation, and we take that on, that if we admit them, we're going to take care of them. Because again, if we get them through, they're going to do important things. But that does cost money. And I think we've de-linked what it really takes to educate a young person and take care of them, because we're doing both, from what people see as the cost. So that's number one. Number two, I think we don't want to lose our philanthropic bent. And there are many institutions where the alums do not support the universities at the level they could. We have a $1 billion capital campaign that we launched about 1.5 years ago, and we're getting about at the halfway mark. But the bulk of what we're raising the money for is student financial aid, to address the question that you're talking about, because the kind of faculty I have are people like Vint Cerf, my good friend sitting over here. And you know, you don't pay them a pittance, because they could go out and do any number of other things. And so that's one element. But secondly, universities have to operate in a different way. Now, I talked about putting the NRC on a more business-like footing. Now, those who work with me at Rensselaer know that we also try to run Rensselaer in as business-like a way as we can, to take those costs out that have to do with administrative things that we can do in a more efficient way, in order to put the money where it needs to be, which is on the students, on the faculty, on the research, and so forth. And the third is that we've got to remember that education, and that includes higher education, is a public good. And it needs to be supported by the state legislatures and by other instruments of government and by people themselves as that. We've gone to a model where it seems to be very transactional. And then the third is that there are choices of study that will pay you more and others that will pay you less. And each individual has to decide what those balances and trade-offs are going to be that relate to, you know, what they want to do with their lives. Now, I can sit here and say that because I'm a well-paid university president. You know, my business is always in the street. But I gave up a tenured position to become chairman of the NRC. And I actually made less money as chairman of the NRC than I was making even as an academic at that point. And I was on some corporate boards before, and I gave those up because I believed in doing government service. And my husband stayed in New Jersey with our son, and we used up our savings because I paid to commute back and forth, to keep him in the school he was in, to put him in the programs. Now, we were both healthy and working and had good middle-class salaries. But my point is that we decided to make a sacrifice. And that was a risk. Now, one could argue that it's a risk that down the line paid off for us, but we didn't know, you know, if we would all both live through it, or if our health would hold up, or what might happen. You can see it today. One can go into a government job and one bad thing happens. If a nuclear plant had a Chernobyl, that would have been the end of my career. So we all make choices, and I can't speak to, I'm glad your daughter is a prosecutor. And, you know, we used to forgive loan indebtedness for those who went into a certain kind of public service. And that's why I say we have to have the kind of conversation about what do we think higher education is. And And many people look to the universities, and so I will say universities have to operate as efficiently as they can and have to drive as many costs as they can out. And we do a lot of that at our university with core infrastructure, shared infrastructure, partnerships, et cetera, because we don't have the world's biggest endowment. And so we do a lot with the money we have. But in the end, we have to get back to what does higher education mean for us? And I don't think it's true of your daughter, but you know, many young graduates go out and they buy a car, although it's becoming less popular than it used to be.
Uber now.
Because they can Uber everywhere. And the cost for them of that is maybe not unlike the debt they end up with from college. So people have to think it through. And so I try to have a balanced point of view about the fact that I know what it costs to educate a young person. And even if we were paid the full ticket price, it's not enough to pay for what it costs us to educate the student. And so there always has to be an offset with philanthropy, with partnership, and with other things. And so we have to decide. Now, there are those who believe that maybe we need to strip down the model of higher education and do less. And that's a discussion. That's a conversation we can have. But there's no denying that the higher education system we have has led us to have the strongest economy on earth. And so I think, you know, it's a funny thing. Before we close, if we could, I do want you all to understand that no person does anything alone. And so I want you to meet my classmates from way back, from elementary school, junior high, and high school. Ira Carr, Paula Duckett, and Diane Parrish. Would you all stand and do that? And if one goes into the government and one doesn't have somebody who understands how the government works, it's very easy to get into trouble. And so I had we called him a personal assistant, but she was my executive assistant the whole time I was chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So I want you to meet Evelyn Williams. What Evelyn's done. But I still depend on a team, and so I'd like all of my Rensselaer team and the officers to stand and be recognized. And my great friend Vince Cerf and his wife, please. Now that is a famous man.
Well, Dr. Jackson.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You are obviously very driven, which influences us. And when you talk about intentionality, that you exude that with that drive. And also, what I feel in all of your comments that you've made tonight, you really operate from an ecosystemic framework. That is the recognition of the need to recognize, rather, how interdependent and connected we all are. And certainly Chernobyl, when you moved on to become chair of the NRC, is an example of that, when evidence of that cloud was appearing in Western United States and Western Europe. We are truly an ecosystem in so many ways. And your whole life and career has been and continues to be dedicated to that notion when you talk about collaboration, partnerships, having colleagues, recognize your colleagues from secondary education. And we are so eternally grateful for that, for putting us in that frame of mind and making us realize why we're here and what we need to be about. So I just want to thank you again, all of us. Please, let's thank the Honorable Dr. Shirley Ann Jackson. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
No, thank you.
Laura, did you want to say anything? Laura, she's still? Okay.